Okay, everybody. Welcome back to Memory and Trauma Through History and Culture, Migration Symposium at Simon Fraser University. For those of you who are not here yesterday, the event's organizers include Humanities lecturers Irini Kotsavili and Alessandra Capardoni, as well as myself, James Horncastle, an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities, as well as the Edward and Emily McQuinney Professor in International Relations. Before we begin day 2 of the event, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that all 3 entities responsible for this event at Simon Fraser University are located on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Before we move on to the 3rd panel, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit SFU IT Services website, whose link can be found in the same email provided to access the webinar. At the conclusion of each segment of this symposium, we will host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the course of the presentations, and we will be sure to address them afterwards. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise your hand button and our event assistant will unmute you. Finally, a reminder to please be kind and respectful. Anyone not adhering to this will be promptly removed. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for the first panel, Sanem Guvench, who teaches at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Her research and interests include critical theory, contemporary social political theory, science and technology studies, and the history of medicine and diseases. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Sanem.
Thank you, James. Thank you for all the organizers. It's great to be part of the event. And welcome everyone to the 3rd panel of the conference and the first panel on the Saturday morning. It's Migration and Politics. And we have 3 speakers today, Samir Gandesha, Jamil Khader, and Eldon Yellowhorn. And I will start by introducing Samir. And then we will move on to other speakers. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can go on to Q&A. So Samir Gandesha is the director of the Institute for the Humanities and associate professor at the Department of Humanities at SFU. He's the author of numerous refereed articles in top-tier journals, chapters in edited volumes, and encyclopedia entries. He's also the co-editor with Lars Rensman of the book Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations. It came out from Stanford University Press in 2012. And he is the co-editor of 2 books with Johan Hartel. One is The Spell of Capital, Reification and Spectacle, which came out from University of Amsterdam Press in 2017. And second is Aesthetic Marks, came out in, again, the same year from Bloomsbury Press. More recently, he has edited Spectres of Fascism, Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives. This year it came out from Pluto Press. And he co-edited with Payman Wahabzadeh, Crossing Borders essay in honor of Ian Angus, Beyond Phenomenology and Critique. He also frequently contributes articles to Open Democracy, Art Papers, Canadian Dimension, Espace Art Actuel, Truth Out, the Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Today he's going to talk about, or his title is Scenes from a Traumatic Political Theory. And off to you, Samir. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanem, for the introduction. I'd also like to add my words of thanks to the organizers of this event, Irini, James, and Alessandra. And also thanks to Lauren for all of her work behind the scenes, setting things up, managing Zoom, and so on. I too also like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The title of my talk, as Sanem mentioned, is Scenes from a Traumatic History of Political Theory. I see this as a possible outline for a research project. But it was really sparked by an invitation from the Le Cancelon to contribute to thinking through some of the contours of our current situation with the pandemic. So it's very much grounded in that kind of a response, but it did get me thinking about the larger history of political theory and some of the different scenes within it. So that's essentially what the talk is about. It's more about trauma than it is about migration. But I would like us to think about migration as not simply something spatial, but rather it's something kind of ontological and existential that entails a very different kind of relation to the place that we actually remain in. So I hope that that becomes clear. So yeah, thank you to both Clint Burnham and Hilda Fernandez for the invitation to participate in their project, sort of collecting writings about the COVID. I think it's called Listening to COVID-19, something like that. So, leisure, argued Thomas Hobbes, is the mother of philosophy. But is this really true? The proposition seems to contradict Hobbes's own experience. His most famous book, Leviathan, in which he portrays life within the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, was far from being a product of leisure. Leviathan was written at the conclusion of the English Civil War and was deeply shaped by the fear that Hobbes himself had experienced during this tumultuous period of English history. Hobbes even took direct aim at the quintessential philosophy of leisure, which was, of course, that of Aristotle. Aristotle defines the good life as a life devoted to quiet contemplation. Yet even Aristotle's aristocratic pathos of distance, that apparently serves as a condition of possibility for philosophy as such, is marked by a darker, unconscious, and traumatic history, not unlike the events that so shook Hobbes. I'll come back to this. The German word for poison is das Gift. Switching between the German and the English denotations brings to mind the close association between the two meanings that suggests the Greek word, and pardon my pronunciation, I'm speaking to a number of Hellenists here, and so I do have to offer those apologies in advance. Didonai, to give, or dosis, gift. The root of the English word dose, signifying something that is given. The COVID-19 virus can be regarded as a dose of poison, das Gift, but which is also a kind of an offering, or in English, a gift. The COVID-19 pandemic brings into view the relation between trauma, which has undoubtedly been induced around the globe. It's truly a global phenomenon at many different levels, at the individual level, physical and psychological, the public level, social relations, forms of governance, the economy, and so on the one hand, and the nature of thinking on the other. So to repeat, COVID-19 really gets us to think about the relationship between thinking itself and the trauma, which is what it really has constituted, and which we continue to, in a sense, to live through. In Plato's Apology, a dialogue that on one reading is roughly contemporaneous with another important text about trauma, which is the Bhagavad Gita, Plato depicts Socrates' ill-fated attempt to defend himself from the charges that he has corrupted the youth of Athens by shaking their faith in the gods of Athenian democracy. In his famous allegory of the cave, in another dialogue, The Republic, depicting the philosopher's arduous education and attempt to instruct his fellow citizens, Plato shows precisely how the philosopher lives in fear of the mob, angered by his attempt to challenge what it takes for reality. This is an allegory not just of the distinction between appearance and reality, and for the necessity and imperatives of philosophical rigor, but also for Socrates' own trial and execution. So it refers back to that profoundly traumatic moment for Plato and Socrates' other students. In his project of engaging in a destruction or destruction of the history of Western metaphysics in Sein and Zeit, Martin Heidegger proposes to bring thinking back to those primordial Greek experiences of being that were, in his view, immediately blocked and covered over by metaphysics' forgetfulness of being, or what he calls Seinsvergessenheit, in its positing of the opposition between being and time. Heidegger can be taken as referring here to Plato's claim in Theaetetus that philosophy begins in Tom Sein, or wonder at being, in its temporal play of aletheia, or the simultaneous nature of concealment and disclosure. The gift, as it were, of Das Gift is that it gives us another way of thinking about the origin of philosophy. Perhaps philosophy doesn't begin in leisure. Perhaps it doesn't begin in wonder or the question of being, of Seinsfrage, as Heidegger puts it, of why there is something rather than nothing at all. What if philosophizing instead begins in trauma, understood as a tear in the fabric of the symbolic order, or the web of meaning that comprises a world, or Lebenswelt, that Heidegger himself describes in his phenomenology of the tool in Sein and Zeit. Alternatively, trauma can be understood as the shaking of the foundations of what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, which is to say the taken for granted assumptions and beliefs that constitute our worldview. For example, that the universe centered on the Earth. Galileo's discovery of the moons of Jupiter were key evidence that could no longer be squared or reconciled with the paradigm that had previously existed, established by the Aristotelian Ptolemaic understanding of the cosmos, and therefore inaugurated revolutionary science. Trauma here can also be understood as that form of historical caesura noted by Theodor Adorno when he, in Negative Dialectics, writes that Hitler had occasioned a new categorical imperative, and that was to organize our thoughts and actions in such a way that the Holocaust would never repeat itself. Hasn't COVID-19 shattered our world in a similar way? Trauma, in other words, is, as Hal Foster frames it in a Lacanian register, the return of the real. For Plato, as I already suggested, the traumatic as opposed to wondrous origins of his philosophy was a trial and execution by the democratic polis of philosophy itself, as personified, of course, by Socrates. Plato's political philosophy is therefore a philosophy against politics, resulting in a perhaps overcompensatory attempt to make the world safe for philosophy. It is, as Hannah Arendt once suggested, a philosophy against politics, masquerading as political philosophy. Arguably, the quintessential moment of trauma presaging philosophy was, in fact, a pestilence not unlike the one we are currently living through. This mythical Theban plague inaugurates that quintessential tragedy and provokes the thinking of a figure that Joseph Gou calls the first philosophy, namely Oedipus. Oedipus's drive to knowledge ends the city's suffering, but begins his own, and of course belies his constitutive lack of self-knowledge. The young Hegel understood the traumatic origin of philosophy in his early attempt to grapple with the post-Kantian landscape of German philosophy, specifically with the systems of Fichte and Schelling. Philosophy comes onto the scene, he argues, in the so-called Differenzschrift, as a way of healing the directions, Zerrissenheiten, that characterized a world torn asunder in the aftermath of the tumultuous and profoundly dislocating French Revolution. A revolution that Edmund Burke understood as entailing the Jacobins' symbolic rape and murder of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. A symbolic murder and rape, which was itself aimed at the symbolic order that was kept in place precisely by the sovereign, right? So it's a double kind of a play here. While Hegel returned later while Hegel will turn such thinking into a theodicy later on in his writings, or the negation of the negativity of evil in a divinely created world, yet another form of overcompensation, one could argue, Theodor Adorno unearths the traumatic kernel of Hegel's philosophizing, brought to a head in Marx's Das Kapital, as what Adorno calls in Negative Dialectics, the phenomenology of the anti-spirit. Universal history is therefore not the progressive realization of a genuinely human ethical form of life, which Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, but just its opposite. Hegel's theodicy entails a logic whose telos is not the plenitude and fullness of spirit, but its abjection, as signified in Samuel Beckett's post-apocalyptic bunker in Endgame, inhabited in proleptic form of social isolationism, so anticipating the very social isolationism that we're living through now, by Claude, Ham, and his elderly parents, who are themselves confined to garbage cans. Everyone across the globe now is wondering whether COVID-19 is not, in fact, the end game of universal history in the guise of neoliberal globalization. COVID-19, therefore, undoubtedly constitutes a crisis. And the word crisis is important to remember, derives from the Greek, crisis, decision, and krinein, to decide. In late Middle English, the word comes to mean, as I think many people understand, the turning point of a disease, that decisive point at which the condition of the patient manifestly improves or deteriorates. Today, perhaps reverting unconsciously to this particular sense of the world when we obsessively swipe up on our smartphones for reports of the current status of the spread, is the curve on the upswing or on the downswing? And the phrase unknown a mere months ago, but now ubiquitous and inescapable, are we, by isolating ourselves from one another, like Ham's unhappy family, flattening the curve? The crisis also has to do with the nature of our neoliberal capitalist social relations. Can we ever go back to the previous normal, the status quo ante? But was that normal ever really normal? Ah, the good old days, sighs Ham's mother. This was, we must remember, a post-human world in which human beings were quickly becoming, as it were, posthumous, which is to say, increasingly obsolete. Here, the refugee, as a very figure of human disposability, and you see evidence of this every single day, amongst other places on the surface of the Mediterranean, truly is, so the refugee truly is what Hannah Arendt once called the vanguard of her people. Edward Said writes, quote, "The novelty of our time, to which New York gives special emphasis, is that so many individuals have experienced the uprooting and dislocations that have made them expatriates and exiles. Out of such travail comes an urgency, not to say a precariousness of vision and tentativeness of statement, that renders the use of language something much more interesting and provisional than it would otherwise be," end quote. Isn't the logic of the virus at some level simply an extension and deepening of the logic of that world, rather than the qualitative break from it? What now must change? Key to understanding this crisis as a crisis, which is to say, as a moment of decision, though one would hope without decisionism of the Carl Schmittian sort, is the extent to which our own traumatic present reveals what Adorno called the primacy of the object, or as alluded to above in a Lacanian register, the anxiety-provoking real. That the integrity of my finite, abject, possibly infected, though asymptomatic, vulnerable body is inextricable from the integrity of the others around me, both in my immediate vicinity, no less than on continents far, far away. Viral pandemics such as COVID-19 and the climate change from which they are inextricable know no borders. The well-being and indeed thriving of my own body is contingent upon the well-being of non-human animal species and the ecosystems they inhabit and constitute. In contrast to the amazement at the existence of why there is something rather than nothing, the gift of Das Gift can be regarded then as a kind of brutal lesson in universalism. It discloses what could be called a negative humanism, grounded not in an ontology or essence of the human, the mystical sendings of being, a la Heidegger, ego autonomy or will to power, but in the inescapable inescapable universalism of a trembling fragility and profound vulnerability to suffering, and ultimately to that final end game, death itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir, very much. Lots to think about and lots to contemplate on. I'm sure that you will have many, many questions. So moving on to our next speaker. Sorry about that. Jamil Kadar, whose talk is titled Recodifying the Refugee, Palestine, Unspeakable Traumas and Global Solidarity. And let me introduce Jamil. Jamil Kadar is Dean of Research and Professor of English at Bethlehem University. He earned his PhD in English Literature at the Pennsylvania State University and taught at Bilkent University in Turkey and at Stetson University at the States. He received various awards, including 2 Fulbright fellowships and various research, community impact, and students advocacy awards. He's the author of 2 books on feminism, and the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and his numerous articles appeared in various international journals and other collections, including Oxford Bibliographies in Literary and Critical Theory, the European Journal of Popular Culture, Journal of World Systems Research, the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, the Middle Eastern Report, Islamophobia Studies Journal, Aerial Feminist Studies, College Literature, Mellus, the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts, the Philosophical Salon, Mondo Vice, Truta, the Palestine Chronicle, and others. Jamil, please, I turn the table to you.
Thank you, Sanham. Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. I really appreciate it. I know it's early for you. It's a bit late for me now. But it's wonderful to see you all, and I really appreciate the invitation and being part of this wonderful group of scholars and academics to talk about important issues and hopefully make connections between the conditions that you have there and our conditions here in Palestine. We can draw many parallels, and my talk today is going to be exactly about that. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation that will go with my talk, so I'm going to share it on my screen now. I hope you all can see it. Okay, so recodifying the refugee, Palestine, unspeakable traumas, and global solidarity. The problem of the Palestinian refugees and their right of return, repatriation, is one of the most contentious issues in the Palestinian struggle for freedom. The question of these refugees, whose number exceeds 7 million people today, rubs against the national master narratives in Israel/Palestine, especially with regards to the founding violence of the Israeli state, the partition of historical Palestine, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, what is commonly referred to as the ongoing Nakba, and the national identities of Palestinian and Israelis, especially the definition of Israel as the state of the Jewish people. Although the right of refugee return, repatriation, is enshrined in international law and conventions, regardless of the historical cause of the original displacement, the applicability of these laws to Palestinians and their descendants is under dispute, to say the least, obviously. I'm not going to get into this because I prepared really a lot of stuff, so I'm going to skip certain things, but I'll be able probably to talk about them in the QA session. But for a long time, it was believed that these refugees claimed the right to return based on Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. even though many Palestinians recognize that a maximalist interpretation of the right of return is untenable. Like all Palestinians going back, all of these refugees going back to Israel proper. For example, only 80 to 90,000 Palestinians returned to the West Bank and Gaza after the Oslo Accords. Moreover, a major 2003 poll of Palestinian refugees and their descendants found out that only a small number of refugees expressed an interest in returning to Israel proper. For the Israeli establishment, on the other hand, the Palestinian refugee right of return is considered a unique demand that aims to destroy the Jewish character of the Israeli state. However, as Taisir Barakat shows in her 2019 excellent book, Justice for Some, international law is subject to diverse interpretations, and Israeli legal scholars have opportunistically wielded international law as a tool to justify the occupation and the colonial disposition of Palestinians. For many decades, many commentators have viewed the Palestinian refugee problem not only as a special case, an exception in the global history of the refugees, but also as an intractable and permanent problem. In fact, in discussions of the recent Syrian refugee crisis, some commentators have referred to the Palestinianization of the Syrian refugee crisis in an attempt to register their fears that the crisis might be intractable and permanent. However, these appropriative rhetorical practices might risk not only erasing the specific histories of the struggle of other refugee communities, but also might risk turning the Palestinian refugee struggle itself into a privileged side of struggle over others as a universal metaphor for forced migration and displacement. In this paper, I explore the ways in which recent artistic works, installations, and paintings in and about Palestine disavow this exceptional status of the Palestinian refugee problem in the global history of the refugees and reject the appropriative practices that aim to Palestinianize the struggle of refugee communities in the Middle East and around the world. I will examine how Banksy's work on the refugees, including an installation in the Waldorf Hotel in Bethlehem, and the Palestinian artist Taisir Barakat's series of paintings entitled Mediterranean Crossings or Shoreless Sea, do not only reinscribe the figure of the refugee in the history of racialized violence and disposability, more importantly, they link the Palestinian struggle for freedom with the global struggle of the refugees, especially the Syrian and African refugees, as the obverse side of the same struggle. In this way, these artists managed to repoliticize the refugee crisis in sort of kind of a nod to the objectives of this conference. So the artist, the first artist, and I hope you can see an image there, you cannot see his face, he's masked, is Banksy. He is an elusive British guerrilla graffiti artist known as Banksy, who is believed to have been born in Bristol, England around 1974, and began his career as a graffiti artist in Bristol's graffiti gang, Drybridge Z Crew, BDZ, in the early 1990s. Soon after, he began to partner with Inky, another notable graffiti street artist. He rose to prominence for his provocative stencil pieces in the late 1990s. Banksy has visited Palestine a few times and organized an art workshop, Santa's Ghetto Collective, with other international graffiti artists during the mid-2000s. He painted some of his most iconic work on Israel's separation and annexation wall in that period in the Kalandia Ramallah area, Abu Dis, Jerusalem, Gaza, and Bethlehem. In March 2017, Banksy opened his boutique hotel cum art installation, a museum and a gallery all together inside a traditional multi-stored building in Bethlehem that had been used to house a pottery shop on its first floor. This work is the result of the collaboration between Banksy and a local Palestinian graffiti writer and entrepreneur, Wissam Salsa, and other local partners. This was very important for Bethlehem's economy and cultural scene, that people believed that Banksy was bigger than Bethlehem's native son, Jesus, at one point in time. There were more Banksy tourists than Jesus tourists at one point in Bethlehem's history. In his artwork at the hotel, Banksy registers the history of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine underpinning the Zionist settler colonial project, the Israeli apartheid regime, and Israeli military occupation of Palestine. But he does that in his own unique Banksy way. Except for the random use of the traditional symbols and insignia of Palestinian struggle, suffering, and resistance, such as the kafiyeh, for example, or the slingshot, he places these Palestinian symbols within the larger intertextual system of ciphers, images, and representations that typify his street art. These symbols, and I'm going to show a few of these images as I talk about Banksy. These images and symbols circulate that circulate in a system, making it impossible to form any substantive Palestinian particular content through these symbols, and allowing for meaning and identities to be reinvented in a radically universal dimension, which I'm not going to talk about today, but this is really what I aim at. One of the images that you see here in the hotel is called Rage the Flower Thrower. Then here's another iconic, very famous painting now in the hotel called Pillow Fight. I have written about these in the past. Just a couple of them to let you see what he has in this hotel. The second artist is Taisir Barakat, as you see him here. Taisir is one of Palestine's prominent artists, was born in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza in 1959, and completed his arts education degree in Alexandria, Egypt in 1983. After completing his studies, he moved to Ramallah, where he has since been teaching and creating art. He has held many solo exhibitions, including in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, in Ramallah, and in other countries around the world like Japan, USA, Europe, and across the Arab world. Barakat has worked with a variety of media and has experimented widely with wood, metal, and glass. Working primarily with paint, inks, and dyes, he uses dark monochrome tones that reflect the hardships of our time and our present life, unquote. As he says, adding that, quote, the pressure on us makes us use dark colors, unquote. While Barakat's artwork has been marketed as drawing inspiration from the ancient past and from the oral traditions and cultural narratives that are intimately tied to life in Palestine, his work also engages the human condition, especially with regards to the global refugee situation, which I'll talk about today. Commenting on Shoreless Sea exhibition, Barakat says that this exhibition is a contemplation into what the Arab people have become and the transformation of big numbers into refugees. With uncertain futures, he adds that it is also a meditation on the coldness of the world as it witnesses the refugee tragedies indifferently. For him, the exhibition is a journey into his inner self as a refugee and an exploration of the meaning of separation from homeland and the loved ones, and how life has transformed the region into big, enormous waves in recent years. In my talk, I'll mention three major aspects or dimensions of the way that Banksy and Barakat approach the problem of the crisis of the refugees today. First, I will talk about how they show the shift in the representation and management of the refugees. At this stage, I'll talk about the representation. In their work, these artists register the immense tragedy and the countless or non-countable and mournable lives and the experiences of Palestinians and the refugees who perish in their attempt to escape their home countries for the safety of asylum in other parts of the world, usually the northern countries. In their materialist and supernatural approaches, respectively, Banksy and Barakat highlight the extent to which the representation of the figure of the refugee is implicated in the image of the homo sacer, the side of politically unqualified bare human life, as the stateless, racialized, abject, surplus humanity. Various refugee study scholars have pointed out the shift in the perception and representation of the figure of the refugee and their administration after the end of the Cold War from the original Eurocentric model of the heroic white European dissenters who fled from totalitarian regimes in Europe to the racialized and faceless abject surplus humanity from the global south. Deanna Thomas, for example, maintains that the refugee category was originally created for the protection of Europeans who were fleeing totalitarian regimes, and as such was meant to capture the heroism of those white European dissenters who were fleeing those oppressive regimes. After the end of the Cold War, however, the figure of the refugee was recodified through the image of the deprived, racialized, and faceless masses, mostly from the South, fleeing extreme poverty and or endemic conflicts. Like other scholars, Thomas makes a direct link between this shift in the representation of the refugees and the shift in the biopolitical management and policing of the refugee through the new asylum regime and new sovereign borders that aim not only to limit the access of the refugee to political protection, restrict their mobility, but also to exclude those who are considered to be, quote, too numerous, too different, or too dangerous inside destination states. I'm going to skip the part on Agamben because I assume that many of you know his work on the Homo Sacer. I will go straight to some of the ways that Banksy represent the refugees. I will talk about the first interesting artwork in the Waldorf Hotel, which I usually refer to as which is placed at the left side of the entrance of the Waldorf Hotel's lobby, which Banksy placed two installations, three paintings as you see on top, and then a fireplace. What is notable about the fireplace are the rubbles and the rubble of stones that you see down there, which I'll talk about later. But I will focus now on the three paintings of the stormy seas that register the tragedy of the refugee crisis through the absence of the refugees themselves and their bodies or corpses. So what Banksy does, and I'm going to show a close-up now of these paintings. I call Banksy's approach here materialistic, and I compare it to Barakat's more supernatural approach to the crisis, which will become evident in a second. But in taking a stark materialist approach to this tragic scene, Banksy's paintings show in the foreground of the paintings the orange life jackets and vests, as well as the rescue tubes that are scattered all over the shore against the background of the stormy sea. The bodies of the drowned refugees are nowhere to be found. And you can see this also in the second painting and also in the third painting. It is important to read this text in the context of Banksy's overall work and his long-time commitment to the preservation of the life and dignity of the refugees. In his dystopian theme park, Dismaland, for example, Banksy put the plight of the refugees at the center of his installation. He thus placed two refugee boats, which you can see here, in a pond, refracting the deathly journey of the refugees to Europe, which is represented through the classic column of a Greek temple or palace. You can see another sort of image of these boats. Okay. Another thing that I would like to mention about Banksy's work for the refugees, and not only in terms of his art, but also his activism, is the fact that he sold one of those paintings in the Waldorf Hotel to purchase a vessel that he called the Louise Michel, after a French feminist anarchist, that conducts all of these search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean. It was reported in recent news that, and actually The Guardian reported that up to the end of August 2020, more than 500 refugees and migrants are known to have died in the Mediterranean Sea. And Banksy has sort of tried to help. Obviously, this is another image of the boat. Since we are scholars and we just simply engage in hagiography and praise, we also need to put this in the context of critical work on what is called SAR, not the virus, but the search and rescue missions. There's an interesting article by Paolo Cotita who talks about, whose title is Repoliticization Through Search and Rescue, a question mark, Humanitarian NGOs and Migration Management in the Central Mediterranean. And it's sort of important to place Banksy's work, the way that I do in general, but also in this case, regarding the rescue missions of the refugees in the critical debates about such SARS missions, because on the one hand, NGOs, he argues, can repoliticize migration and border management by, quote, questioning, influencing, and contrasting governmental policies. But on the other hand, they can depoliticize the issue by supporting, through the enhancement of overall SAR and transport capacities, the institutional system of migration and border management, by relieving states from their SAR responsibilities, thus allowing them to focus on border enforcement, by providing a humanitarian legitimation for exclusionary policies and practices. In Barakat's work, I'm gonna talk a little bit about Barakat now. You can see the first image here, one of my favorites, and sort of represent the supernatural approach to the problem itself. Barakat captures more directly the shift in the representation and management of the refugees, but he applies the supernatural perspective to the topic. The scenes of the Mediterranean crossing in his paintings feature boats full of refugees in the sea, quote, souls flying in the skies, rescue missions, a mother holding her children tightly, two lovers, border patrols, a helicopter flying over the heads. Heroic journeys culminate in a line of detained refugees walking to an unknown destination. In particular, he uses three major themes or motifs to highlight the depth of the immensity of the crisis. One that is really a favorite of mine is the way that he draws on iconic representations of the slave ship in a way that inscribes the current refugee crisis and the history of the transatlantic slave trade in images of the faceless, abject, and disposable surplus humanity from the global south. The juxtaposition of these experiences encodes the refugee smugglers in the Mediterranean in the role of the slave traders and slavers. In these paintings, the refugee passengers are lined up in rows and crammed in the tight spaces atop the deck. The inhumane conditions of the passage across the sea are captured through the white ghosts of the dead refugees, the two ghost figures floating over the ship in the first painting, and the dead heterosexual lovers in the middle of the book in the second one. And I'm showing the second painting here. And obviously, what struck me about these images is sort of what I remembered about slave ships and the way that the slaves were lined up on the deck of these ships, as you can see in these images, this one, and this close-up of the way that, and this is from drawings of the Brooks slave ship. Now, in Barakat's work, what's really interesting also about him is this emphasis on the inhuman conditions and brutality of these Mediterranean crossings that end up in the tragic death of the majority of these refugees. In the following painting, the living and the dead commingle, forming some sort of a dance, the morbid dance of death, as you see here. Look at them, they're sort of kind of holding hands and dancing together. These scenes of death begin to blur the line between the living and the dead in his paintings, so that in this series of paintings, it becomes really hard to tell whether the signs of the refugees represent the living or the dead, or perhaps the undead, those who live in that zone of indistinction that Agamben talks about. The living and the dead inhabit a space of indistinction, perhaps becoming the undead Homo sacer itself. In the first painting, the dark silhouettes of the refugees intermingle with the white ghosts of the dead refugees, but the doubling motif raises questions about whether, in this painting here, whether the dark silhouettes are representations of living refugees or not. And again, he continues with playing with or blurring the lines between the living and the dead, that in the end, really, it becomes really hard to know whether you're talking about a graveyard or a camp for these refugees. Even a painting like this, for me, makes it really impossible to tell where the signs of life begin and where the signs of death ends. And in this painting here, it seems that the refugees have drowned, they are underwater. But again, are they dead or are they alive? Because if they were dead, they will be represented through the white ghost, but still they are represented in these sort of dark or bluish silhouette. Again, Barakat insists on blurring these lines to foreground the conditions, perhaps of death and life. And there's another one here, the final one, which basically, again, these dark silhouettes perform what I call the spectral performatives of the ghost. They float, they dance, they move. They don't act the way that he represents the living. Sanem, please let me know if I have more time. I just have one quick thing to talk about.
You are at 22, 23 minutes.
Oh my God, okay. So I should be done, right?
Yes,
Okay.
ideally.
All right, okay, great. I will just briefly say that the image that I began the presentation with, for me, captures the other sort of major theme in their work, that is the politics of solidarity, the new one that they are helping us form. As you can see here in this installation, the fireplace, Banksy placed these three paintings of the refugees on top, but then at the bottom he puts a heap of the rubble from probably a destroyed Palestinian home in Bethlehem or the region, making a direct connection between the two, that these two catastrophes, the two tragedies, are two sides of the same struggle. Okay, this is really important for me because I know Samir talked about Saeed, but Saeed tends to sort of talk about the experiences of the oppressed in terms of parallels, and he juxtaposes the struggle of Palestinians with others, leading to, in some situations, to what we call the victimization Olympics among oppressed groups. I would like to avoid that and talk about more how all of these struggles are really the byproduct of the global capitalist system. Barakat does the same by using these boats, an image of these boats, and then an image of the Palestinian woman, or a woman who represents Palestine in the sort of traditional national iconography of Palestinian art. The woman is looking there in this particular, the last one that I just showed. You can see that the woman here is also identified with the refugees in her shape and form. She is a silhouette, she's a dark figure. Anyways, to conclude, and thank you for bearing with me, Banksy and Barakat reject the depoliticization of the refugee crisis through the humanitarian perspective and propose instead to repoliticize this crisis by drawing attention to the exclusionary political system that northern countries use to manage police control and eliminate the problem of these abject surplus humanity. More importantly, they reinscribe the struggle around the fundamental antagonism of the class struggle that reveals the ugly truth of the global capitalist system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamil. This is great, and I can see how parallels with both Samir and yesterday with Rabia's presentation. So I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. And finally, our third speaker today is Eldon Yellowhorn. He is the professor and founding chair of Department of Indigenous Studies at SFU. He's Piikani and has family and cultural ties to the Pagan Indian Reserve. His early career in archaeology began in southern Alberta, where he studied the ancient cultures of the plains. He's especially interested in the mythology and folklore of his Piikani ancestors in both ancient and recent times. He was appointed to faculty at Simon Fraser University in 2002 and established the Department of First Nation Studies in 2012. He served as chair from 2012 until 2017, and he teaches courses dedicated to chronicling the experience of Aboriginal people across Canada. He is the past president of the Canadian Archaeological Association, which he served from 2010 until 2012, and the first Aboriginal person to hold this title. He continues his involvement, excuse me, he continues his involvement in the CAA and is now the co-chair of the Ethics Committee. He is also working on the Ethics Task Force with the Society for American Archaeology as it reviews its statement of ethics for its membership. Throughout his career, Dr. Yellowhorn has been an active advocate of the right of Aboriginal people to be active participants in examining the past through their internal dialogue on the nature of antiquity. He developed his internalist approach to bring a self-reflexive quality to field research that enhances this perspective by appropriating the methods of archaeology to pursue internally defined objectives. Dr. Yellowhorn is a writer whose compositions have appeared in scholarly and popular journals. His published works included encyclopedic treatments of Indigenous people and educational books for young readers. And today, Dr. Yellowhorn is going to talk about Indigenous people and migration in 21st century Canada. Here, thank you very much for participating.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I have a PowerPoint that I would like to use, and so I will just get that started. Just to give you some idea about the talk is going to, address the topic that we're discussing today, but also, I'm still an archaeologist, an anthropologist, so I kind of make my presentation conform to that. So I'll start up my PowerPoint here, and all right. So I want to look in specifically at this idea of Indigenous people and migration in 21st century Canada. Since I think, two decades into the new century is not too soon to start contemplating what has transpired and what lies ahead. But first, I want to do a proper introduction. So using Blackfoot here. Okay, Nistoko Kutskina. Nitipi Ganikwan. And not to see po and more muscuum squamish slaver to with the waxist. So first of all, just to look at my own migration, I'm not an Indigenous person from the West Coast. I come from the center of the continent. In fact, that area of southern Alberta and northern Montana is known as the crown of the continent because all the waters flow away from this point into either the Arctic or to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Pacific Ocean. So the specific reserve I'm from is called the Pagan Indian Reserve. It's on the Canadian side of Blackfoot territory, Blackfoot country. In the old days, Blackfoot people controlled a territory that had its western frontier in the Rocky Mountains, some of the Rocky Mountains. And the eastern frontier was roughly where the Saskatchewan, Alberta border is, east into eastern Montana. And the northern boundary was the North Saskatchewan River, which we call the Elk River. And the southern boundary was the Yellowstone River, which is actually a Blackfoot word, or Blackfoot toponym. That's where we got paints known as ochre. My own people, the Blackfoot, include the Siksika and Gayano and Piikani. I'm from the Piikani. Our English name is, or our name translates into English as scabby robes. And we're also known as Pagans from historical journals. The Pagans are divided into the Abatsa Piikani, who are in Canada in the Saskatchewan River Basin, and the Amskapat Piikani, who are the South Pagans in the Missouri River Basin. So my Piikani ancestors practiced their mobile lifestyle. We called it the old dog days on the northern plains, which in chronological terms runs from about 10,000 years before present until the year 1725 AD. And this was the country where, yeah, my Piikani ancestors were no strangers to mobility, because that was their lifestyle, and all their material culture was devised to promote their movements. You know, for example, here's an encampment of teepees. You know, and teepees are the original mobile homes. You know, they can be taken down and carried to another location in one day and set up again. And so people would use this as a way to travel around to their seasonal camps during the summer. So their winter camps were their homes. And in Blackfoot, we counted winters in the manner of a calendar. And in fact, when we started a new winter, our New Winter's Day had a special day, special name. It was the going home day. It's also known as the Autumnal Equinox. Yeah, the horse days on the northern plains began around 1705. The dog days, and then there's the horse days in the 1725 until 1880. Interestingly enough, you know, as an archaeologist, this is something I've learned. We find fossils of horses in southern Alberta. I've worked at several excavations where among the faunal remains, we found fossils of horses and other extinct fauna that once lived on the northern plains. But many of them went extinct with the last ice age. Just like the horses, they went extinct in North America at the end of the last ice age. However, some did cross the Bering Strait land bridge and they colonized Asia. And these were the ancestors of the modern horse. So horses came back to North America via Spanish colonies in Mexico. And as the Spanish moved northward into the Puebloan country, the New Mexico, Arizona, that country today, they brought horses with them. Now, one of the places that they established a mission was Taos, New Mexico. And Taos, New Mexico, well, Taos was an old town, way before there was even an old Mexico, I suppose. Taos was an old town, you know, it's about 1,000 years old now. And they used to have a trade fair there. So Indians from the southern plains would go there to the trade fair and trade whatever they had. And so the Kiowa people were the people who traded for some horses around 1620 AD. And they were the ones who brought horses back to their original habitat on the plains. So it took about a century for horses to move northward as they were traded. So they became part of Blackfoot culture around 1725. And by the time the first Anglophone reached the northern plains in 1754, horses had already transformed Blackfoot culture. And they had also greatly enhanced the mobile lifestyle that Piikani and other Plains Indians practiced. So the reserve days began in 1880 and continue to this day. Treaty 7 in 1887 created lands reserved for the use and occupation of the Blackfoot Indians. But they did not settle on reserves immediately. Only about 1880 did they settle on those reserves. And the year 1880 is not accidental, because that is the year when bison went extinct on the northern plains. The hunting economy that had its origin during the last ice age ended. Blackfoot and other indigenous people settled on their lands and began their careers as farmers and ranchers. Now, Indian reserves is a Canadian term, reservations is a US term, but they are unique to North America. And their intent was to isolate indigenous people away from the mainstream of Canadian society. And tropes such as the vanishing race proposed by anthropologists became the basis for social policies concocted by the federal government. Yeah, in many ways, Indigenous people see themselves as prisoners of democracy because you know, the 19th century was especially difficult for our ancestors since the genocidal policies of modern democracies undermined their security. Thus, confinement on reserves rather than diaspora defines the historical experience of Indigenous people. And after the failed Métis uprising in 1885, Indigenous people required a pass to leave their reservations. Failure to return on time was a criminal offense punishable by jail time. And this pass system and other overtly discriminatory clauses were part of the Indian Act until 1951, when there was an attempt at modernizing the statute. So confinement on reserves meant that there was no place for Indigenous people in the modern nation that Canada had become. However, that was not the end of the story. We're not the end of history. That was just Canada's first century. You know, we have 5 generations of Indigenous people encountered Canada in its first century, from 1867 until 1967. And in retrospect, we can see that the Canadian experience was unique, that the Canadian experience that each generation experienced was unique. For example, the group, the cohort from 1867 until 1887, they saw the creation of Canada. They signed treaties with the new country, and they were the first to feel the impact of the Indian Act. 1887 to 1907, well, this group witnessed the dawn of the 20th century and the death of Queen Victoria, which was a very momentous occasion, you know, because she was a monarch for almost 70 years. The generation from 1907 to 1927 was the generation to experience the nadir of the Indian population. They also participated in World War I. This was the generation, you know, the nadir of the Indian population had been falling for a long time, but then 1921 was the year when there was documented evidence that the Indian population was starting to grow again. The group from 1927 till 1947 experienced the Great Depression and also participated in World War II. 1947 to 1967, this generation was the first, felt the effects of the first modern amendments to the Indian Act. But as Canada's first century was coming to an end, what came clear to Indigenous people is that they had reached a stalemate with Canada. However, to use the old hockey adage, sometimes a tie is as good as a win. 1967, you know, Canada was in the mood for big changes, not just with you know, Canada celebrating its centennial, but really becoming a self-aware, self-confident nation. But Native people were also feeling that, and so they started to take to radical activism and direct action. But these were too much for the state, and these options only invited the state to demonstrate its ability to impose its will using police action, etc. Thereafter, you know, the radical activism turned to pragmatic activism as people came to realize that resistance of that sort was futile, but they still rejected the other offer which was on the table, which was assimilation. You know, this was one that was evident in the white paper that was proposed by Pierre Trudeau. So at this point, the big question they were faced with, where do we go from here? Because Indigenous people had rejected the old relationship of the ward and guardian. That was just no longer tenable. And the time had come to rethink the relationship with Canada. However, this time, human rights would become part of the equation in this new relationship. So what Indigenous people, when they considered their own place in Canada, what did they think about? Well, the first thing that what distinguishes Indigenous people is that we do not owe our existence to Canada. Our autochthonous polities have existed here since ancient times, and we have customary ways of making our decisions. These polities were constructed by indigenous people who had distinct cultures. But today we are ultra minorities in our own countries, but we do manage to influence the way development projects evolve. We are also marginalized in Canada, even as we pose significant challenges to the state's claims of ownership to resources and lands. Hence the sentiments that a lot of Native people walk away from their relationship to describe their relationship with Canada as Canadian if necessary, but not necessarily Canadian. So what we are engaged in now is there's a search for a new end game. How are we going to define our future relations with Canada? So in my own training, as an anthropologist, we have long examined the social function of mythology. What purpose does it serve? And we posit that we create myths to help us put our minds in balance with the world out there. So reconstructing mythology for a new era is vital for the collective imagination that Indigenous people need to get beyond their stalemate with Canada. There's nothing wrong with those old stories about time immemorial and the heroes and legendary characters. However, the world in which those mythologies made sense and explained doesn't exist anymore. And so where there are many in this generation who are still looking for that cognitive star that provides the imagination. And many people don't have it, and that's where they are lost, and as a result, they can't function well in society. So we know that there will be 5 generations that will come of age between 1967 and 2067. So it's necessary to focus their energy on a grand project that will cross generations. And that's where the mythologizing comes in, because each generation will add a distinctive element to that contest. But taken together, they involve one grand project, which I call Colonizing Canada, because it will describe the diaspora of Indigenous people who exchange reserves and remote communities for city life. Indigenous people will not replicate or isolation or confinement in Canada's 2nd century. So our modern dilemma requires that we imagine scenarios that offer us other than resistance and assimilation. Indigenous people are searching for places to invest their dreams, but that offers an opportunity to reconnect with hope. Their project builds upon the paradox of the Indigenous experience in modern Canada, too weak to win, but too strong to lose. So we have to look for ways to imagine our trauma and migration now. So although our perspectives of diaspora occurs within the borders of Canada, we do share common characteristics to the migrant experience. And we are certainly no strangers to trauma. That's everywhere in our lives. So this is where we recognize that this is where we will make our place, this is where we'll make our stand. And if assimilation is out of the question, how do we practice our distinct cultures? This is something that I struggle with on a daily basis. For example, I'm a native speaker of Blackfoot, but maintaining connection to that traditional language is very difficult because there are no other Blackfoot speakers that I meet with on a regular basis, so I can't practice. But that means I've become more adept. For example, Blackfoot never existed as a written language, but myself and other people using our linguistic skills have developed a written version of Blackfoot, and we practice that. Urban Indigenous people become disenfranchised from the politics of their communities when they follow economic opportunities available in the city. However, some groups, such as the Nisga'a, have devised a system to keep their citizens engaged even when they live away from the Nass Valley. It uses the chapters in a union as its model, so that the Vancouver chapter where there's a large Nisga'a population, the Vancouver chapter will select leaders who will represent them on the Nisga'a Council. So they don't have to become disenfranchised when they leave the Nass Valley. So just some final thoughts here. This is one of the questions that we're going to have to deal with. What is the end game of diaspora for Indigenous people? Why are we doing this? Well, Canada is changing, and we have to prepare ourselves for the changing nature of Canada. One of the things that I see on the not too distant future is the baby boomers generation. This was a large cohort in Canada that from the year just after the Second World War until the early 60s. And as this cohort ages and fades, the demographic profile that will emerge on the other side will mean a country with no white majority. At the same time, Canada will be more crowded, and social and spatial mobility will be our reality. We will live in larger cities and have fewer direct ties to our customary lands. Some of us will experience existential threats brought on by environmental change that might drive migration. Thus, building resilient cultures that help us adapt to new conditions will ensure our survival as distinct peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eldon, for a very stimulating talk. Right now we have about half an hour to 35 minutes because one of the panelists for the next panel is unable to attend, so we can go on until 11:20, which gives us quite a time for discussion. I'm sure there are lots of points, and if you want to ask questions, you can do so using the Q&A function there, or you can raise your hands. And if nobody wants
I'm not able to raise my hand for some reason. The function is missing.
Okay.
Yeah, same here.
Okay. So
probably because we are presenters too. So if you don't mind, I would...
please go ahead, Alessandra.
I wanted to ask Eldon, one of the last points that you touched upon, the existential threat brought on by environmental change that might drive a migration. If you could elaborate a little more about that, because this is a topic which is of particular interest to me, the connection between migration and environmental issues in relation to the existential position of the subject, of course. Thanks.
Oh, sure. So thank you very much. I especially think about the First Nations who are coastal peoples, and who are, like, for example, the Tsawwassen First Nation, which has just recently signed this large land claim agreement, and their whole community is practically at sea level. So even with just a meter rise in sea level is going to completely threaten their community. And where do they go if they cannot, they've already signed this final agreement that gives them a land base on the coast, but then the coast is disappearing. Where do they go as people? The same can be said for many of the communities on the west coast of Vancouver Island that are, some of them are on islands. And so they had to start planning on the strategic withdrawal, the strategic retreat from those coastal communities as we start to experience sea level rise, which, by all accounts is inevitable. We're going to see it happen. In the country where I'm from, we've got our reserves there, but we know from from my studies in archaeology, we know that the Northern Plains is on the edge of being a desert sometimes, and if the temperatures rise even just a little, and we have a few drought years, it will become very desert-like in the landscape that we would see. In the past, when there were fewer people around, there was always someplace else we could go. But now, we're living in a crowded country. It's not so easy to just pick up and move.
Thank you, Ravia.
Thank you everyone for that, those awesome talks. My question is for Jamil. I'm wondering if Banksy or Taisir have commented on your work, or if you know what they think about how you frame and read their installations.
Thanks, Ravia. Thank you, everyone, for Samir and Eldon for engaging presentations. Well, let me say this, that in the beginning, when I was sort of doing my work on Banksy, I was really too excited to I really wanted to know a little bit more, but I think finally I accepted the postmodernist axiom that the author is dead. So it didn't really matter to me who Banksy is or whether I can meet him or whatever. But I've heard from sources that he tried to figure out some of the things that I've written about him. I wrote about 4 pieces on the Waldorf Hotel, 2 opinion pieces. One began as an opinion piece for Al Jazeera when the whole debate about the Waldorf Hotel erupted. People accused the project of being a sellout, war porn, and whatever. But I completely disagreed, since I was in the area. I teach at Bethlehem University, and I am in Bethlehem a few days a week, so I was able to visit there and stay there. And I could see exactly the opposite of what people who were writing about it didn't see, since they didn't really visit it. And then I wrote another piece that sort of expanded on the argument in Al Jazeera, and then I did an article on a Foucauldian analysis of the hotel in terms of the tourism industry. And I know that he tried to figure out what heterotopia means in my article. So that was really nice. And I almost spoke to him on the phone, but it didn't happen. I was busy doing my work. But again, he's a great guy and a wonderful person, but I'm not really, I'm past that stage of, wanting to meet Banksy. With regards to Taisir, I know that actually he did call me and contact me about my interpretation, because originally I was asked to, I was invited for an interview at the Waldorf Hotel regarding his work and other people's work. And after looking at his work, I came up with that interpretation, and I emphasized the slave trade and the transatlantic journey. And he was really excited about it. He told me he didn't even think about it. So I was really happy. And when I decided to participate in this conference, I thought it was really a good opportunity to develop these arguments. So yes, at least directly, I know from Taisir. I spoke to him. He was supposed to come today, but I wish he did. He could have spoken to us a little bit more. But I know at least a little bit that Banksy, tried to figure out some of the things that we do in our academic work. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you. Clint?
Oh yeah, thanks, Janem. Yeah, this is a great panel this morning, quite fantastic. Eldon, I was actually in Taos about a year ago when I was at a conference in New Mexico. So that amazing history you were providing us with of horse trading going back to the 17th century. And it's it's a beautiful pueblo, as you know, if you've been there, but if you haven't, I definitely recommend checking it out. But I have a question that sort of tries to bring together Samir and Jamil's papers, if that's okay. And I guess the question I would ask, and Jamil, this is, of course, in solidarity with the work that you're doing, but I do wonder if, and I agree with what Samir is saying about philosophy arising out of trauma, if I can just brutally summarize Samir's argument. But where are the philosophers in your paper, Jamil? And then Samir, what philosophy do you see coming out of the migrant crisis? Because Jamil, I think in some ways what Banksy, at least, and I don't know Taisir's work well enough to speak about it, but even when you were comparing it to the slave ships, these seem to be pictures. These seem to still be depictions of abjection and of absolute suffering, and you know, and that's the limit of the Agamben Homo Sacer kind of trope, is that it's still about this kind of absolute suffering at the level of that kind of subject. And does a philosophy arise out of that absolute suffering, Samir? So that's a two-part question. So I don't know who wants to take it on first.
Samir, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Clint, for that question. So the question to me is, what sort of philosophy might arise out of the crisis that we face today, which is, you know, one. And I really like the way that Jamil framed this in terms of, you know, not just a kind of humanitarian crisis. We have a real problem if we just see this in a narrow way. That then becomes a question of the management and various practices of the nation state, which is in fact part of the problem. So how can it actually be the solution? It can't. So we have to frame this in terms of the contradictory nature of the global capitalist order. So what kind of a philosophy can come out of this? I mean, I think that it would have to be something like a homeless philosophy, you know, in a sense that philosophy itself arises from a condition within which we experience the uncanny, and we can understand this at an individual level, a psychological level, of course, at the level of artistic representation, of course. I mean, Freud's famous essay on the uncanny is really about different forms of literary representations of, in particular, the double, the automaton, and so on. But it is also at the level of the uncanny in the way in which Heidegger also understands it, as being not at home in the world. And I think that this is what I was sort of referring to in terms of this phenomenology of the anti-spirit. I think this is probably the best way of understanding the task of philosophy today, understanding or grasping the contours of the way in which the world that is constituted by the global neoliberal order, while its effects are differentiated and cannot be simply understood as unified, you know, there is a sense in which it is the world of the anti-spirit. And so our approach to philosophy can't be understood in terms of this kind of conversation between the moderns and the ancients, dialogues between cultures and so on, well, exclusively, but it has to have a critical component lying at its very heart in terms of trying to understand the way in which philosophy doesn't embody spirit, but rather its abject other, its lack of spirit. It's, you know, and I really like the way that Jamil was talking about this via Agamben. The Agamben was very much in the background, but the idea of the undead, you know, the living dead. And this is, I'll end on this. It's maybe a reflection on that slogan. It's actually an epigram to minima moralia. Yeah, life does not live. So philosophy must grasp the various ways in which life fails itself, as it were. Yeah.
Well, Glenn, thank you for the question, and Samir, thanks for the thoughts. I guess, you know, for me, as I approach these issues from mostly a Zizekian perspective that is informed by Lacanian philosophy, I'm always sort of, you know, even when I talk to my students about issues that we are talking about here in terms of representation of the world or the relationship between art, representation, and politics, we really have to bear in mind the question of the totality of the social experience itself and whether we can really get into a complete understanding of that totality, which is, again, from a Hegelian perspective, and Samir, I know, talked about Hegel before, that it's really impossible. So for me, one thing that I especially from my perspective as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, looking at many different narratives, and an American citizen as well, you know, looking at many different narratives, trying to figure out exactly how to deal or theorize the trauma that is very personal. And as you probably noticed, I don't really bring in the personal aspect of this traumatic history into my narrative. And I do that deliberately. Because theory for me is that space of reflection where I really would like to transcend the individual and not limit the sort of, the politics of location that was very popular in the 80s and 90s. It's important in many ways, but to me, it has led, as I say, and briefly in this paper, and I'm developing this in a book project about Palestine, the victimization Olympics, the grounding arguments in identity politics, political correctness. There are certain issues, and again, I'm learning from also the debates that Zizek had with, has been having with many sort of people about these issues. But one thing, the philosophy that really, I alluded it briefly, but I will sort of talk about it and lay it out there, is what Zizek calls concrete universality. It's something that really impacts the way that I look at the world. The image of Malcolm X and his X and the representation of that philosophical approach to the world, that you are a citizen or an individual, a subject in an international global capitalist system that really determines what you are and who you are, because we have the capacity to move around the world as a result of all of these global capitalist dynamics. Our particular cultures do not determine who we are. They're very important for us, but they are not the realm within which we form our identities. And Zizek talks about that in many ways. He uses, and I repeat that in some of my writings, his example about the Haitian Revolution, for example. And again, Malcolm X is a very central figure in his analysis of this notion of concrete universality. But looking at this again from the particular perspective, the context in which I am in, but the way that I do it, and I realized this when I was doing the piece on Zizek for the Oxford bibliographies, is that the way that he begins his books, he always begins with the global capitalist system. And he tends to sort of make these assertions and statements and analyses of the global capitalist system. I do the opposite. I begin with what we can call the secondary contradictions. Because I've written in my career in the United States when I was teaching there, I sort of written about all forms of difference almost, gender, queer rights, Native Americans, American Indians, I've talked about African Americans. I mean, these differences were very important to the way that I engaged into these discourses in the United States as a person who migrated willingly for a scholarship to America. But when I do it now, it's sort of, I begin with these secondary contradictions only to move to the fundamental antagonism, because to me, we are missing a big opportunity about theorizing the way that these contradictions, align around or structured around the global capitalist system itself. This is really what connects us together, because as long as we, rally around certain contradictions, which are very important, but they cannot really get us together. And I mean, you hear all of these stories for people who get criticized for appropriating, the struggle of others. But so how can I speak about our experiences together? And I think that for me, that image of the fireplace in Banksy's Waldorf Hotel is very important. You have the struggle of the refugees, you have the struggles of the Palestinians, but both of them are connected as the two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same international struggle within the global capitalist system. I don't know if this answers your question, Clint, but these are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great points. I'm going to ask Mohammed to ask a question, and kindly turn to Lauren to unmute him, please. Thank you.
Hi. Actually, my original question was going somewhere where Clint's question was going. but with the answer with Dr. Gandashia's and I'm actually going to modify my question a little bit. So I wanted to see if do you think there is a new political wave, new political schools coming out of this? Usually it happens after philosophers comes and paves the way to a new direction, but we've seen globalization. We don't know if it's working or not. Do you see especially what's happening with democracy right now, especially in the state? Do you see any new school of thought or directions or new political systems kind of come out from this trauma?
That was directed towards me, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That's a very interesting and an important question. I would just point to one development and give a particular example of that development that relates, I think, directly to what we're talking about in this conference. And I would say that that development is populism. So populism has not just, I'd say, emerged, but has returned, right? Populism has been with since the 19th century, and indeed it has been a key backdrop to the formation of what has become social democracy in this country, although you can't really even say that the NDP is any longer a social democratic party, but it has its roots in the CCF, which was a populist movement. And of course, we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, populism re-emerging, both left-wing populism, a la, say, Bernie Sanders, coming out of Occupy, Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum in Labour, and both of those are in a sense now failed projects, as we know. But one of them, and this could also be seen as a kind of failed project, but it came out of something a little bit different and more interesting, I think, for our purposes, and that's in Spain, Podemos. Very interesting sort of left populist formation that came out of, so if we have Sanders coming out of or being bolstered by Occupy, and Occupy itself being inspired in part by the Arab Spring, Jeremy Corbyn and this influx of left-wing activists into the Labour Party called Momentum. You have Podemos that was motivated by, amongst other things, the Indignados movement. But also it had its roots, or has perhaps to some extent still its roots in certain kinds of migrant and refugee solidarity movements in various Spanish cities. And I think that's the most interesting, because populism, whether left or right, tends to remain fairly wedded to the nation state and tends to divide the people both against, a powerful kind of, oligarchy, the power block, or whatever you want to call it, on one hand, but also from certain threats from below. So migrants, refugees, migrant labor in particular, as an attempt to sort of double down on the borders of the nation state. But Podemos is interesting precisely because of a certain kind of opening to and solidarity with these migrant movements and refugees. So I think there's an interesting opening for a different kind of populism. I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Samir. Actually, the next question comes from Andreas Agusti, and it is again for you. And here is what Andreas says. If I understood correctly, your thought-provoking talk relied on a distinction between trauma on the one hand and wonder or leisure on the other. But there are scenes in the history of political thought where wonder is trauma, for example, Saul of Tarsus here, or trauma occurs in situations of leisure, that is Oedipus and Jocasta's marital bed. What do you make of these scenes? In some, I suppose I'm not sure what you see, if you do indeed see, as special about the distinction between trauma and leisure/wonder.
Thanks very much. That's an excellent question slash comment, which is a provocation for me to think a little bit more in a more nuanced and subtle way in relation to this distinction. I started there precisely because of what I thought was an obvious contradiction within Hobbes's self-understanding. You know, Leviathan wasn't born of leisure; it was born of a moment of civil war, which of course resonates a little bit too closely for us today. You know, looking at what might happen in the aftermath of the U.S. election. And of course, if we look across the globe, we see many wars, some civil, some international. So that was, in a way, the provocation. But I agree, certainly we can find examples in which the two are not separated at all, but rather the one is a condition for the other. But I would say that leisure as a category is different from leisure as, let's say, a moment or a context in a text, as in the example that you sort of throw back at me, which is very well done, that of Oedipus and his relationship with his mother. So thank you very much. I think that's an excellent question. I'll think more about it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We still have about 12 minutes to go. If not, let me see. Okay, Robert Beshara to Professor Yellowhorn. He asks, may you speak to solidarity among indigenous tribes in North America between US and Canadian-based tribes, in other words?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. That is a very timely one. You know, oftentimes we will see, you know, for example, events such as the Standing Rock of opposition to the Keystone Pipeline, I think it was, and they had an encampment down there on their lands, and people from across North America solidarity. You know, back in the early 90s when we had the crisis at Yansatake, again, people from across North America kind of gathered to show their solidarity. But there are also other ways in which they do. You know, for example, this back a while ago, there was the Idle No More movement, which mobilized people, you know, across the country, but to a certain extent in the United States as well. But it's more of a Canadian phenomenon. And these are kind of ephemeral social populist movements, if I can borrow Samir's term there. And this kind of populism has its own expression, you know, that we saw. But then it's also very ephemeral, and then it ends. But what happens afterwards, you know? And it's examining the legacy of these movements. That's where we see the change coming from, you know. I liken it, you know, for example, the Idle No More, you know, like how do we envision something like that? The closest real life analogy I can imagine is when you go to sporting events, or back in the old days when we went to sporting events, and people would do the wave, you know, and you would get the whole crowd in the arena participating in it, but then it dies down, you know. So yeah, they come along, but then they do leave a legacy, you know. And in the case of the wave, you know, people become engaged in the sporting event, and they are more active in it, and creates a feeling of solidarity with the people there. So the same with a movement like Idle No More. It springs up very rapidly, but then it also disappears very rapidly. But it's the legacy that it leaves behind that where we see the effects of it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I have a question comment for Jamil and Samir. Because one of the things that I see happening in both your talks and in the way that you are trying to conceptualize the current moment, if I may say so, is precisely through break. So what is fascinating, I mean, the break is incredibly apparent in Samir's talk, right? It's all constructed upon the break, on the caesura. But in Jamil, in yours as well, when Banksy's works, after all, both works that you concentrated on, they're triptychs. And there is a break between the figures. In the first figure, the figure that throws the rock, it is divided into three. And again, the open sea is also divided into three. So my question is, and I mean, this is not really a question, but this is more of a contemplation, if you wish. Not that we are doing contemplation in the current moment, like a philosophy through contemplation. But is it this, the break itself, a way for the new subjectivities to emerge in the global moment, that we are participating in the questions of politics on a global scale, on a local scale, through the break and through the trauma that we are experiencing? And is it, so you can also like think about it, I think my Lacanian friends would like this, but maybe the split subject is the new subject, and the condition of the split itself as a way to enter into both conversation and into political alliances with one another. I don't know if I'm making sense here.
It's definitely an interesting question, Sanem, and comment, and I haven't really thought about it, but I guess in terms of the flamethrower, the break that I see usually, and that's how I interpret Banksy's work, and I think it's really radical in many ways, is sort of redefining the Palestinian struggle not through the traditional signifiers of that struggle, where the break becomes reading his work in the context of the signifiers and symbols and ciphers that constitute his work itself. So in this sense, it's a break. But again, you know, how do Palestinians react to it and respond to it is something different. I mean, early on, the way that one of his pieces was called Slingshot, and he portrayed a rat, Banksy's famous rat, which is very symbolic for Banksy. It's a revolutionary figure for him. And people criticized Banksy for using a rat to represent the Palestinians. Okay, like, you know, I'm an academic, so I can see this in a different way because I'm doing my research, I'm reading, I'm trying to figure it out. I'm putting his work in Palestine in the context of his international work. So it didn't offend me, but many people sort of were offended, and that artwork was defaced. Or in another piece it's called Donkey Papers, he represents, shows a Palestinian soldier stopping a man with a donkey and basically asking the donkey for papers. So again, people sort of are offended, thinking that is making these parallels between Palestinians and the donkey, which is very offensive in our culture. But again, you know, there is a break, and the break I see in the possibilities of solidarity that he is offering us. And this is really why it's really important. So when he puts, or he draws these rats in the Waldorf Hotel, if you enter the lobby on the left side or the eastern side of the lobby, behind the bar, you will see 3 major clocks with these rats. And if you know his work, you will know that rats represent the unemployed and unemployable in the global capitalist system. So why not? I mean, for me, yes, I want to be that rat. You know, that's really the most important symbol for that solidarity. But again, I think the break comes from reconfiguring the discourse and the narrative and the traditional sort of presuppositions that we carry with us when we have certain expectations about Palestinians, or certain expectations about Indigenous people, or about, you know, other groups who experience different sort of experiences of oppression or histories of oppression. So how it is captured in form, to answer your other question, again, part of it is really looking at how he reconfigures these things. Perhaps the tripartite panel is important. I didn't really think about it, but what was important for me is the way that he changed the kafia to a baseball cap. And obviously, instead of having the Molotov cocktail, you have a flower bouquet. That's a major reconfiguration of the iconography of resistance that many people are, actually many people expect of Palestinians. But I think that the break comes up with this new discursive formation that he's offering.
Yeah, if I could just weigh in as well. Thank you, Jamil, for that. I mean, you could see this this reconfiguration as a kind of détournement, sort of deturning this iconic image into something radically different to undermine its hold on us. You know, the spectacle of the terrorist, the rock thrower, and so on. And so that disrupts the narrative of the Israeli state and its allies. I think this is really important. But I would caution one thing, and I think this is precisely where Zizek can help us, where Lacan and psychoanalysis more generally can really be of assistance here. And that is undermining the rationalist premise upon which so much, let's say, political organizing is based, which is to say that if we simply recognize our common condition today as disposable subjects, as abject, and so on, all being subject to the same kinds of logics of global capitalism, again, recognizing the differential effects in North and South, and then also within particular zones, urban versus rural, and so on. I mean, Fanon's great phenomenology and description of the settlers' town versus the Kasbah and so on. These really important things to bear in mind. But I think it's precisely the way in which there's a recognition on the part of many that they are themselves becoming disposable, they're becoming obsolete subjects, that doesn't lead in the direction of solidarity. It leads in the direction of manipulated fear and anxiety, hatred and anger. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in the United States today, almost a kind of projective identification of the very conditions that are becoming ever more global, what Mbembe calls the becoming black of the world, and a disavowal of this, and an attempt to project those processes only onto certain kinds of racialized others. And I think this is precisely what can short circuit solidarity. So we have to work against that, and we have to draw on the insights, I think, of psychoanalysis to again, challenge that rationalist premise, which is just so much a part of our kind of liberal democratic understanding of the definition of interests and the pursuit of those interests within a rational political space. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for the question/comments on it.
Can I add something just to what Samir's saying?
Sure.
I think just sort of what I would say to Samir basically is that all of these concepts that we use and the terminology that we use is always up for grabs in public discourse. And the metaphorical use, I mean, you I'm sure remember how post-colonialism was considered to be radical and revolutionary in the early days. But now everybody's post-colonial. Going back to the, prehistory of humanity, everybody's post-colonial. It doesn't really make any, I mean, part of it, and I think this is really why we need to think about the global capitalist system, because within the system, you can really talk about how these radical revolutionary concepts are appropriated and accommodated into the system, that they lose their power, they lose their teeth. You don't have any power to these terms anymore. And this is really why do we need to reinvent and continue to reinvent. That's why it's concrete universality, reinventing the struggle for every generation, for every country, for every population, and being aware that whatever radical politics we have is always up for appropriation in this system. That tomorrow, as what happens to Che Guevara, you know, his face can adorn watches, underwears, T-shirts, anywhere. You know, it's a game that, you know, we are aware of it, but we have to be really to continue fighting when it comes.
You truly are preaching to the converted on that score. And I would just like to leave the final thought, and that is you emphasize radical on numerous occasions, and I couldn't agree more. And radical means going to the roots of things, and the roots of things really, you know, is the law of value. It's the commodity form and its production on a global scale. So I think we're fully in agreement on this, Jamil. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we're 2 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to thank all the panelists. This was, and everyone who participated into the discussion. This was great. There were 3 more comments. I will leave them on the chat. Maybe you can chat over the break. I wish I could have said like we can chat over coffee, which is waiting for you outside the room, but unfortunately that's not true, or maybe in your own home. Anyways, thank you so very much. We will return at 11:40. And if I may ask kindly the panelists of the next panel to return back at 11:35, please. And see you all there. Bye.